In 1883, the Smithsonian Institution began systematically cataloging burial mounds across the Ohio and Mississippi River valleys. The effort was serious, federally funded, and methodical. The men doing this work were not adventurers. They were archaeologists with notebooks, measurement tools, and government authorization. Their reports described human skeletal remains measuring between 7 and 9 feet in length. Multiple sites, multiple examiners, consistent measurements. Those reports still exist in the Smithsonian's own archives. The skeletons, according to the institution that collected them, do not. That is the starting point of this investigation. Not a legend, not a folk story, but a bureaucratic paper trail that ends without an adequate explanation of where the physical evidence went. The question is not whether these reports were written. They were. The question is why the documentation survived and the specimens did not, and why, after approximately 1900, reports of this kind effectively stopped appearing in American and European scientific literature entirely. Something changed. The record shows it changed. The official explanation for why it changed is largely absent. Between roughly 1820 and 1900, newspaper accounts, county histories, and formal archaeological surveys across North America recorded the discovery of oversized human skeletal remains with unusual frequency. These were not isolated reports from remote locations. They came from settled areas: Indiana, Wisconsin, Minnesota, New York, Tennessee, Kentucky. They came from mound excavations, road construction sites, and agricultural land clearing. The 1894 report from Smithsonian archaeologist Cyrus Thomas, titled "Report on the Mound Explorations of the Bureau of Ethnology," runs to nearly 750 pages. It references skeletal remains described as significantly larger than contemporary human averages, found within burial contexts that also contained carefully worked copper artifacts, engraved tablets, and mica sheets sourced from hundreds of miles away. Thomas was not writing sensational journalism. He was producing a government report with site coordinates, stratigraphy descriptions, and artifact inventories. The remains he described were sent to Washington. The current institutional position on those specific specimens is, at best, vague. At worst, it is absent. This raises a straightforward technical problem. In the decades since Thomas's report, archaeological standards have become more rigorous, not less. Cataloging procedures are more detailed. Chain of custody requirements are more strict. Physical evidence is harder to lose, not easier. Yet the pattern runs in reverse. The older the report, the more specific the physical description, the more recent the institutional response, the more general and non-committal the language. That inversion is worth examining. The newspaper accounts from this period are often dismissed because they appeared in regional papers without scientific credibility. That dismissal, applied uniformly, creates a problem. Some of these accounts were not published in isolation. They appeared alongside contemporaneous coverage of local elections, business disputes, and weather conditions. In other words, within factual reporting frameworks where accuracy had direct social consequences. The editor of a small Ohio County newspaper in 1880 had a readership that included the farmers on whose land the discovery was reportedly made. Fabricating a story about their property carried obvious risks. More significantly, some accounts were not newspaper-generated at all. They appeared in County Historical Society records compiled by local physicians, lawyers, and former military officers. Men whose professional identities depended on credibility. A report from Sauk County, Wisconsin, compiled in 1876, described the excavation of a burial mound yielding skeletal remains measuring 8 feet 2 inches. The report named the individuals present, described the location relative to existing property boundaries, and noted that the jaw was large enough to fit over the face of an adult male present at the excavation. That last detail is not literary embellishment. It is a measurement presented in comparative terms with a live reference point. It is the kind of observational note a careful person makes, not a dramatist. The jaw, the skull, and the long bones were apparently sent to the State Historical Society of Wisconsin. Current inquiries to that institution regarding oversized skeletal remains from that period receive responses noting that collections from that era were often poorly documented and that many items were deaccessioned or lost during facility transitions. That is plausible as an explanation for isolated cases. It is less plausible as an explanation for a pattern that repeats across dozens of institutions in multiple states. The Smithsonian Institution holds a specific and difficult position in this investigation. On one hand, it is the institution most frequently cited in early accounts as the recipient of oversized skeletal remains. On the other hand, it is the institution that has most consistently stated, in response to modern inquiries, that it has no record of such specimens in its collections. In 2014, a Freedom of Information Act request was submitted to the Smithsonian, requesting records related to oversized human skeletal remains in its National Museum of Natural History collection. The response acknowledged the existence of a large osteological collection, but did not confirm or deny the specific specimens in question, citing ongoing cataloging work and the complexity of historical acquisition records. That response is not proof of concealment. Bureaucratic vagueness around century-old collection records is genuinely common, but it sits alongside a specific institutional history that is harder to dismiss. The Smithsonian's Bureau of American Ethnology, active from 1879 through 1964, produced detailed field reports across 8 decades. The early reports, from the 1880s and 1890s, contain explicit physical descriptions that have not been reproduced or updated by later institutional statements. What changed between 1900 and 1964 that would cause a major research institution to stop encountering and documenting what its own earlier researchers had encountered and documented? The official answer, to the degree that one exists, is that the earlier reports reflected a period of less rigorous methodology, and that later, more careful excavations simply did not reproduce the same findings. That explanation is worth taking seriously. Measurement errors in the 19th century were real. Standards were inconsistent. Bones can be misarranged during excavation in ways that produce misleading length estimates. But that explanation, applied consistently, would predict a gradual decline in such reports as standards improved. Some confirmed, some refuted. A messy transition period with competing data. What the record actually shows is not a gradual decline. It shows a relatively abrupt cessation concentrated around the turn of the 20th century, followed by near-total institutional silence. A gradual methodological correction looks different from an abrupt stop. The reports are not confined to North America. In the same decades that American newspapers and survey teams were documenting oversized skeletal remains and burial mounds, comparable accounts were appearing in European archaeological literature. In 1868, workers excavating near Castelnau-les in southern France uncovered skeletal remains that drew the attention of anthropologist Georges Vacher de la Puge. He described and measured fragments that, by his analysis, belonged to individuals of exceptional stature. His measurements were published, the specimens were analyzed. The findings appeared in a credentialed scientific context. Current mainstream archaeological discussion of that site does not generally include those measurements. They appear in historical literature reviews as anomalous and unresolved, rarely as refuted. There is a distinction between a claim being investigated and found incorrect, and a claim being absorbed into a category of things that are not actively examined. The Castelnau specimens fall into the second category. They were measured, published, and then effectively set aside. Vacher de la Puge's other work has been discredited on separate grounds. He was associated with racial theories that history has correctly rejected, but the specific question of what he measured and whether his measurements were accurate is a separate question from his ideological positions. Those two questions have, in the institutional record, become fused in a way that makes the physical evidence harder to examine cleanly. That fusion is worth noting, not as evidence of conspiracy, but as a mechanism by which inconvenient physical data can become associated with discredited conclusions, making both easier to dismiss together. Section 5. Narrative American Oral Traditions. The Smithsonian's own ethnological reports from the same period, the late 19th century, document oral traditions among multiple Native American nations that include references to a race of large-statured people who preceded them in certain territories: the Choctaw, the Comanche, the Sioux, and several Pacific Northwest nations all have documented traditions describing encounters with or displacement of people described as significantly larger than themselves. These accounts are not identical. They come from different geographic regions, different linguistic families, and different cultural contexts. They were not coordinated. They were recorded separately by different ethnographers over several decades. The mainstream anthropological position on such traditions is that they reflect cultural memory of conflict with other groups, mythologized over generations, and should not be read as literal physical descriptions. That is a reasonable interpretive framework. It becomes less satisfying when applied to traditions that specifically describe physical characteristics, height, bone structure, dietary practices, that are consistent across groups with no documented contact with each other. Mythological figures tend to vary in their details when they develop independently. When independent traditions share specific physical measurements, the convergence requires explanation beyond parallel mythologization. The official explanation accounts for the existence of these traditions. It is less successful at explaining their specificity and their consistency. Consider what would need to be true for the mainstream explanation to be fully correct. Across approximately 80 years in multiple countries, dozens of trained observers, including government-employed archaeologists, physicians, and surveyors, would need to have systematically mismeasured skeletal remains in the same direction. Not randomly, not with some overestimates and some underestimates, consistently upward. Measurement errors do happen. They happen more often with deteriorated remains, with fragmented bones, with excavations conducted in poor lighting or under time pressure. But the reports in question are not uniformly from difficult conditions. Some describe careful, methodical excavations with multiple observers present, with measurements taken by individuals whose other work in the same reports, site dimensions, artifact counts, stratigraphic depths, has been treated as reliable. If we accept that Cyrus Thomas's measurements of burial mound diameters were accurate and that his artifact inventories were accurate, the methodological critique requires us to believe that only his skeletal measurements were systematically wrong. That is a selective application of skepticism. The alternative, that some of the measurements were accurate, creates its own set of problems, because it means the physical specimens that were collected and sent to institutions should still exist somewhere in those collections. Physical anthropology has advanced considerably since 1900. DNA extraction from bone, isotopic analysis, and 3D geometric morphometrics can now answer questions about ancient populations that were completely inaccessible to 19th century researchers. If specimens from the mound excavation era still exist in institutional collections, even fragmentary, even degraded, modern methods could establish definitive information about their origin, age, and physical characteristics. The absence of that analysis is itself a data point. The approximate date around which these reports cease appearing is not arbitrary. 1900 sits at a specific intersection of institutional developments. The Smithsonian's Bureau of American Ethnology was fully operational and increasingly centralized in its methodology. The American Anthropological Association had been formalized, establishing peer review structures that filtered what constituted acceptable evidence. The professionalization of archaeology as a discipline, with formal credentialing, institutional affiliations, and publication gatekeeping, was effectively complete by the turn of the century. Before that threshold, the people doing excavation work were a mix of professional surveyors, interested amateurs, local historians, and early academic archaeologists. The reports they produced went to various institutions, local historical societies, and newspapers without a unified filtering mechanism. After that threshold, the discipline had a center of gravity. Reports went through peer review. Physical specimens went to credentialed institutions with acquisition protocols. What was considered publishable became more constrained. This transition had genuine scientific benefits. It reduced fabricated reports, improved methodology, and created consistent standards. It also created a single point of institutional authority over what evidence was considered credible. That concentration of authority is not inherently suspicious. Every scientific discipline develops it. But it does mean that after approximately 1900, the range of evidence considered acceptable narrowed significantly, and the specific category of evidence that had been appearing in reports before that threshold stopped passing through the new filters. Whether that stoppage reflects improved accuracy or changed criteria is the question the record cannot answer on its own. The phenomenon is not limited to North America and 19th century France. Ancient textual sources from Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, and the Levant contain references to people of extraordinary stature, not as mythological abstractions, but as specific individuals, enemies, rulers, and physical obstacles encountered in military contexts. The Hebrew texts that became the Old Testament contain multiple references to groups described as Nephilim and Anakim, terms translated variably but consistently associated with large physical stature. These are not spiritual or metaphorical references. They appear in military and census contexts, counted among populations and listed among enemies. The Goliath narrative is the most familiar, but it is not isolated. The same texts describe entire clans and geographic territories associated with these groups, with specific names, locations, and eventual defeats. Mainstream biblical scholarship treats these references as mythological inflation of real but ordinary enemies. a literary device to heighten the accomplishment of military victories. That interpretation is coherent. Cultures do inflate the physical characteristics of defeated enemies. What is harder to explain within that framework is the geographic and temporal distribution. Mesopotamian texts from different periods and different political contexts describe comparable figures. Egyptian texts reference specific encounters with large-statured peoples in ways that include physical details not required by the narrative function. If these were purely literary devices, the details would be expected to vary by cultural preference. They show a consistency that literary invention does not easily explain. There are structures in the archaeological record whose construction raises questions about the physical capabilities of the people who built them. The dolmens of Western Europe. Single-chamber stone structures in which a large capstone rests on upright supporting stones exist in the thousands across France, Spain, Ireland, Britain, Scandinavia, and the Iberian Peninsula. Some capstones exceed 100 tons. The official explanation for how these were erected involves timber rollers, earthen ramps, large labor forces, and extended construction periods. That explanation is technically plausible for the largest examples. It is less satisfying for dolmens located on hillsides, in areas with limited flat approach terrain, or in configurations where ramp construction would require more material and labor than the structure itself. None of this proves that the builders were unusually large, but it establishes a physical context in which unusual human stature would be relevant, and in which its absence from the record is more notable. The same pattern appears in the megalithic constructions of Malta, the Moai of Easter Island, and the stone platforms of Polynesia, structures whose weight, precision, and placement create logistical problems that the associated population sizes do not easily resolve. The connection between oversized skeletal reports and megalithic construction is not evidence. It is a pattern, two unexplained phenomena that share a temporal and geographic distribution in ways that raise questions neither explanation currently addresses. In 1990, the United States passed the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, commonly known as NAGPRA. The law required institutions receiving federal funding to inventory Native American human remains in their collections, and where cultural affiliation could be established, return them to descendant communities. The law had clear and legitimate humanitarian motivations. The Smithsonian and other institutions had, in the 19th century, collected human remains in ways that are now recognized as ethically indefensible. NAGPRA's implementation, however, created a procedural consequence relevant to this investigation. Under the law, human remains returned to tribal nations can be reburied according to traditional practices. Once reburied, they are no longer available for scientific analysis. This is not a criticism of the law or its purpose. The repatriation of improperly obtained remains to descendant communities is ethically appropriate, but it does create a circumstance in which the physical specimens most likely to resolve questions about skeletal dimensions from the mound excavation era, if any still exist in institutional collections, could be transferred and interred before modern analytical methods are applied to them. The question is not whether repatriation is correct. It is whether the application of the law has, as a practical consequence, reduced the possibility of resolving specific physical questions that the 19th century record raises. That consequence does not require intent. It requires only that the process move faster than the analysis. Walk through the physical anthropology collections of major natural history museums and the pattern is consistent. Remains that fit within the expected range of human stature are cataloged with detailed physical descriptions, site provenance, associated artifacts, and radiometric dates. Exhibits are built around them. Academic papers cite them. They are integrated into the larger narrative of human prehistory. What you do not find in exhibits, in published catalogs, and accessible collection records are physical remains described by the institution's own 19th century employees in terms that fall outside that range. This is not hidden. The older reports are available. The Bureau of American Ethnology reports can be downloaded. Cyrus Thomas's 1894 report is publicly accessible. The descriptions are in print. What is absent is not the documentation. It is the institutional follow-through, the acknowledgement that these descriptions exist, the explanation for why the specimens they describe are no longer present, and the application of modern methods to whatever remains might still be in storage. The documentation survived. The specimens apparently did not, and the gap between those two facts has not been formally addressed. In science, when a hypothesis is wrong, the process of correction is typically visible. Claims are made. They are tested. The test results are published. The claim is revised or abandoned. The record of that process is itself a form of evidence. Evidence that the scientific community took the claim seriously enough to investigate it. The skeletal reports from the 19th century do not fit that pattern. They were not systematically refuted. There are no published studies in which researchers returned to the excavation sites, examined the original specimens, applied corrected measurement techniques, and demonstrated that the original dimensions were errors. The claims did not fail a rigorous test. They were absorbed into a category of things that do not receive rigorous tests. That is a different process, and it produces a different kind of silence. When a claim is tested and found wrong, the record shows the test. When a claim is classified as not worth testing, the record shows only the absence of the test, which can be misread from a distance as the absence of the claim. The 19th century skeletal reports are present in the historical record. What is absent is the formal investigation that would either confirm or permanently retire them. That absence is not an accident of history. Institutions that preserve documents make choices about which documents generate follow-up research and which do not. The investigation cannot stop at Atlantic boundaries. Sardinia presents a case that the European archaeological community has not fully resolved. The island contains thousands of nuorgi, prehistoric stone towers built between approximately 1900 and 700 BCE, constructed from massive basalt blocks without mortar, with interior chambers and corbelled ceilings that required precise structural knowledge to remain standing across 3 millennia. Within several nuorgi excavation sites in the 19th and early 20th centuries, skeletal remains were reported that fell outside standard human proportions. A specific site near Nuoro, documented by Italian archaeologist Alberto La Marmora in the 1840s, described remains that he estimated at approximately 7.5 feet. La Marmora was a trained military cartographer and naturalist. His geographic surveys of Sardinia are still referenced as foundational documents. His skeletal observations from the same surveys are not. The Sardinian case introduces a geographic data point that the North American framework cannot explain away on its own terms. The argument that American 19th century reports reflect the cultural context of frontier mythology, a period of tall tales, land speculation, and regional boosterism, does not transfer to a Piedmontese military officer cataloging a Mediterranean island in the 1840s. Different country, different cultural context, different professional background, similar physical observation. The convergence across contexts does not prove the measurements were accurate. It does complicate the explanation that they were products of a specifically American cultural moment. There is a category of physical evidence that is harder to attribute to measurement error because it does not involve bones at all. Across multiple ancient sites, doorways, thresholds, and architectural passageways exist whose dimensions exceed what standard human proportions require. The entrance passages of several megalithic tombs in Ireland, including examples at the Carramore Complex in County Sligo, are constructed at heights and widths that exceed functional necessity for people of average stature. The additional height serves no structural purpose. It adds construction complexity without adding stability. At Baalbek in modern Lebanon, the temple platform contains 3 stone blocks, known as the trilithon, each weighing approximately 800 tons. They are positioned at a height of roughly 20 feet above ground level, resting on a lower course of 50-ton blocks. The mechanism by which they were raised to that position has not been replicated by modern engineering under comparable constraints, meaning without cranes of a kind that did not exist at the time of construction. The standard archaeological position is that a combination of ramps, levers, and large labor forces accomplish this. That explanation requires the ramp to have been larger by volume than the platform it was used to build. It also requires the removal of that ramp to leave no archaeological trace in a site otherwise characterized by extraordinary preservation. The explanation exists. The physical evidence required to confirm it does not. What connects Baalbek to this investigation is not the stones themselves, but the architectural scale of the project, a scale that assumes, at minimum, that the people directing and executing the work were operating at a physical and organizational capacity for which the surrounding historical record provides no preparation and no continuation. The capability appears. It is used at extraordinary scale. It stops. That pattern, peak capability without developmental sequence, followed by abrupt cessation, is consistent with what the skeletal reports describe in biological terms. This distinction matters, and the investigation requires that it be stated carefully. There are two possible explanations for why the physical specimens from 19th century mound excavations are not currently available for analysis. The first is institutional loss, the ordinary entropy of large collections managed across long periods, with facility changes, funding gaps, administrative transitions, and shifting preservation priorities. Under this explanation, the specimens are gone because institutions are imperfect, not because anyone decided they should be gone. The second is deliberate removal, a decision made at some point within an institution or across institutions that these specific specimens should not be accessible to ongoing research. The available evidence does not allow a confident choice between these explanations. What it does allow is a narrower observation. The pattern of loss is not random. When institutions lose collection items through ordinary entropy, the losses are distributed across categories. Items of high interest, high documentation quality, and high provenance clarity are less likely to be lost than items of marginal interest with poor records. The specimens in question were, at the time of their collection, items of high documented interest. They were specifically noted in federal reports. They were measurements taken by credentialed researchers. They were transported to major institutions with acquisition protocols. By the criteria that normally predict preservation, they should have survived. The fact that they did not, while the paper records describing them did survive, suggests that whatever process removed them was more selective than ordinary institutional entropy typically produces. That observation does not establish intent, but it establishes that the loss pattern requires a more specific explanation than general institutional imperfection provides. Return to the starting point. The Smithsonian Institution's Bureau of American Ethnology produced detailed, government-funded reports across the final decades of the 19th century. Those reports described, in measured and technical language, physical remains that do not match the standard distribution of human stature. The institution that produced those reports still exists. It has one of the largest collections of human osteological material in the world. It has access to analytical technologies that would have been unimaginable to the researchers who wrote those reports. And the specimens those researchers described, specifically the ones that fall outside normal human size ranges, are not part of the active, publicly documented collection. That is a factual statement about the current record. It is not a theory. It is a gap. The question the record raises is not whether giants existed in some mythological sense. That framing reduces a specific evidentiary problem to a question of belief, which is precisely the move that makes it easier to set aside without examination. The question is narrower and more technical. If trained government researchers in the 1880s and 1890s consistently documented physical specimens with specific, measurable dimensions, and those specimens were transferred to a major institutional collection, what is the current physical status of those specimens? Where are they? If they were lost, when were they lost, and under what circumstances? If they were destroyed, under what institutional policy were physical specimens from federal archaeological surveys destroyed? If they were transferred, to whom, and where are the transfer records? These are questions with answers. Bureaucracies generate paper trails. Institutions have acquisition logs, deaccession records, and transfer documents. If the specimens existed, and the reports suggest they did, the record of what happened to them also exists somewhere. The reports were preserved. The photographs from some excavations were preserved. The artifacts recovered from the same sites were preserved. The skeletal remains described alongside those artifacts are the one category of evidence for which the institutional record goes quiet. What the investigation across all these sections, North America, France, Sardinia, the Mediterranean, the megalithic structures of Western Europe, suggests is not a single event or a single institution responsible for a single decision. It suggests a pattern in which a specific category of physical evidence consistently fails to survive into the modern analytical period, across multiple countries, multiple institutions, and multiple centuries of documentation. Patterns that consistent do not typically result from coincidence. They result from a shared condition. Whether that condition is a shared methodological error, a shared institutional tendency, or something that has not yet been formally named or examined. The evidence does not disappear on its own. Something happened to it, and the explanation for what happened, if it exists in any institutional archive, has not been made publicly available in the century and a quarter since these reports were written. The documents still exist, the specimens do not.